Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode of Unfit to Print. I'm your host, Amber Athey. I'm the Washington editor for The Spectator and a senior Blankley fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Before we get started, if you would please subscribe to the show on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, we would really appreciate it. And if you would like to become a subscriber to the show, you can head on over to amberathey.supercast.com. Couple of housekeeping items. I know it's been a minute since the last episode. I was taking a much needed vacation at the beach, just got back and then had to run up to New York for a work meeting. So I'm finally back home and settling in and really excited to be back to Unfit to Print, bringing you guys this week's episode. First order of business, President Joe Biden announced on Thursday that he tested positive for COVID. This is after he already got his initial 2 vaccine shots, followed by 2 boosters. There's actually been a recent study that suggests people who have had the booster shots are more likely to catch COVID, even if they supposedly have milder symptoms. But of course, the first statement that the White House put out from Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was about how Biden was, of course, happy to have been double boosted and double vaxxed because he's doing just fine and is working remotely. And they actually took a video of Joe Biden, it looks like out on the White House balcony, without a mask on, mind you, talking to the cameraman, assuring Americans that he is perfectly healthy. Go ahead and take a listen to this.
Hey folks, guess you heard this morning I tested positive for COVID. But I've been double vaccinated, double boosted, symptoms are mild, and I really appreciate your inquiries and your concerns. But I'm doing well, I'm getting a lot of work done, I'm going to continue to get it done, and in the meantime, thanks for your concern, and keep the faith, it's going to be okay.
Let's drive this home with an amazing video from the Washington Free Beacon. They do these mashup videos on occasion of past things that politicians have said or the media have said, and they actually put together a few clips of the various things that Joe Biden has proclaimed about COVID, from it being a pandemic of the unvaccinated to him shutting down the virus, and it's such a great watch. Listen to this.
Anybody who contracts the virus by essentially saying masks don't matter, social distancing doesn't matter, I think is responsible for what happens to them. I'm not going to shut down the country. I'm going to shut down the virus.
Joe Biden getting his COVID-19 vaccine.
This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Well, I'm going to shut down the virus. It isn't about public health. I'll shut down the virus, not the economy. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. Now I'm going to get my booster shot. I'm going to shut down the virus. This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Excuse me.
You know, you're supposed to cough into your elbow.
The vaccine can stop the spread of these diseases. Now I'm going to get my second booster shot. I'm going to shut down the virus. Excuse me. Anybody who contracts the virus, I think is responsible for what happens to them.
Justin, President Biden testing positive for COVID-19.
Now, outside of our ridiculous national response to the coronavirus, we also have to talk about Joe Biden's health. This has been a running topic for years now, really since he decided to run for president, and the media doesn't want to talk about it, and they're going to downplay the president's coronavirus diagnosis, even though when Trump had it, they all insisted that he was going to keel over because of his high blood pressure and weight. And Joe Biden is inarguably way more frail than President Trump. And yet they're all acting like this is no big deal. But Joe Biden has had a string of health issues since deciding to campaign for president, and none of them have really been taken seriously. The most obvious of these are his mental incapacities, and these are obvious for anyone to see. He constantly is stumbling over his words. He's unable to complete sentences. He has these gaffes where he says completely the opposite thing, or the wrong country name, or the wrong leader name. And the media has tried to brush this away as the remnants of Joe Biden's childhood stutter, even though he himself claims that he got over that stutter and that it doesn't happen to him anymore. And really what's going on is when you get older, yes, you're more likely to forget things, but also what can happen with the deterioration of the mind through diseases like dementia is those tics, those verbal tics can actually return. So if he is having that stutter come back, then that's a sign that his mental capacity is deteriorating. But obviously, the clips that we've seen of him trying to speak publicly reveal that this is much more than just a stutter. There is actually something that is really wrong. And then there's all of the physical ailments that Joe Biden has suffered. And he has had skin cancer a couple of times, which is usually not a big deal. Most people recover from skin cancer pretty easily. It's usually just a removal of the cancerous portion of the skin. Of course, that's not to say that it can't be serious for some people. But in Joe Biden's case, the skin cancer removals were successful, and he apparently didn't have any lingering effects from those. But oddly, this week, before he tested positive for COVID, he was giving a speech about something to do with windshields on cars where he grew up, and said that this had caused everyone from his hometown, including himself, to have cancer. And he used the active phrase that he has cancer. And once again, this was just brushed aside, even though the president essentially gave us an announcement that he has been diagnosed with cancer. Listen to this.
And guess what? The first frost, you know what was happening? It had to put on their windshield wipers to get literally the oil slick off the window. That's why I and so damn many other people I grew up have cancer. And why for the longest time, Delaware had the highest cancer rate in the nation.
Now, I'm not sure if you guys remember this, but back after President Donald Trump had COVID, there was this major investigation as to whether he knew that he had tested positive ahead of one of the presidential debates. And the media was up in arms about the fact that he had potentially exposed other people at the debate to COVID because he was on the debate stage not wearing a mask. Well, Joe Biden is now apparently putting this cameraman's life at risk by doing this unmasked video on the balcony, but of course there is no similar outrage. What I find really fascinating, though, about Joe Biden testing positive for COVID is the fact that he has consistently blamed the unvaccinated for the continuation of the pandemic. You guys might recall he released this awful statement back in the winter saying that the unvaccinated were facing a winter of severe illness and death, and said that this was a pandemic of the unvaccinated, and has continuously mocked and ridiculed and denounced people who have refused to get the vaccines for whatever reason that they might not want to, whether they don't need it because they're young and healthy, or maybe they are immunocompromised and have been advised by their doctors not to get the vaccine, or maybe they just want to be able to take the risk of getting COVID and don't think the vaccine overall is worth it. Plenty of valid reasons why someone would choose not to be vaccinated. But the Biden administration set this really arbitrary goal of getting a certain number of Americans vaccinated. And when they had trouble meeting that, they decided to start deriding people who were choosing not to get the vaccine and essentially blaming them again for the continuation of the pandemic. Well, here's Joe Biden, who has had 2 vaccines, 2 boosters, and still has tested positive for COVID, because it turns out that all of our public health officials have no idea what they're doing. Deborah Birx, who was one of the COVID advisors to President Trump, has released a new book, or at least excerpts from the new book. And in these excerpts, she essentially admits that they were making things up as they went along. She says that when deciding on the 15 days to slow the spread, she knew that it would need to happen for much longer in terms of the lockdown, but she didn't have the data yet to make that case to the president. So how did she know that she would need more than 15 days of a lockdown if the data didn't back that up yet? She had to find data to fit her conclusion. And that's not how science is supposed to work. But clearly these people already had it in their minds that they were going to pursue a certain public health initiative and certain public health policies, regardless of whether or not the science actually backed those up. And Deborah Birx also admits that they didn't want to say that they were doing an indefinite shutdown or lockdown because they didn't want Americans to have the perception that they were being locked down. So they limited small gatherings to 10 people, which she also admits was completely arbitrary, and that she wished the number had actually been 0, meaning people would have to isolate by themselves in their homes and not meet with anybody else. But again, she didn't want to do that because she didn't want to give Americans the perception that they were being put on lockdown. So everything surrounding the pandemic in terms of the treatment options, the public health policy, and all of the things that Fauci and Deborah Birx and all of these other COVID advisors told us have turned out to be a lie and actually not based on any science whatsoever. And I think Joe Biden testing positive for COVID after getting all of his booster shots and then heralding them as keeping him with mild symptoms is really just emblematic of how silly this entire endeavor has been. This next story is actually infuriating, so buckle up for this one because I promise it is going to make you really, really mad. There was a police shooting in Minneapolis of a young man named Andrew Techley Sundberg, who was 20 years old, and he was shot dead by police snipers after a hours-long standoff with the police. And this young man, Andrew Sundberg, had apparently been stalking his female neighbor for months and went through this bizarre psychotic episode where he started shooting into her apartment building where she was there with her children. And somehow this guy who was armed and actually shooting at people became the new George Floyd. People in Minneapolis started protesting on his behalf. His family claims that this was an improper shooting because he was simply suffering from a mental health crisis and they were supposed to send in social workers to talk him down, and the police should have never shot him. They say that this is like Jacob Blake, who I would also remind you had a knife when he was shot by police. But to the left, this is just another example of police brutality. This is not a justified police shooting, even though this guy had, again, been trying to kill people and was in a standoff with police where he refused to surrender his weapons and come out and surrender himself. His parents also claimed that they were not allowed to try to negotiate with their son while he was locked inside of this residence, which turned out not to be true. The news companies have actually found a recording where his father is telling him, "Come out, son, it's okay, we're going to take care of you." And so that turned out not to be true. But across Minneapolis, they've been having these vigils in George Floyd Square, and people have been donating to a GoFundMe for Andrew Sundberg's family. As of July 16th, about a week ago, his GoFundMe had more than $15,000 raised for his family. And the single mother who was with her kids and was shot at by Andrew Sundberg only had been able to raise $2,000. So he outraised her by more than 10 times. And this is a guy who was going on a shooting spree and was peppering her apartment full of bullet holes. Absolutely nuts. But the story gets even crazier because these protesters, part of the woke left who decided that this was another case of police brutality, actually showed up outside of the home where this crime occurred. And while the protesters were outside, and if you guys are watching this on YouTube or Rumble, you will see that most of them are white libs. They show up outside the home of Arabella Foss-Yarborough, who appears to be Hispanic, and she actually shows up. She's driving home, her kids are in the car, and kudos to this woman. She goes off on these protesters. And I'm going to play this video for you guys in full. Just be aware it's a little bit long. It's, I think, 1.5 minutes, almost 2 minutes. But it's worth listening to it in its entirety, both to listen to the truth that she shares with these protesters, and also the insane response from some of the people who are out there protesting on behalf of this guy who tried to murder her. Everything about it is insane. You get to hear the warped woke left ideology and then the voice of reason, and it's so good. So even if you can't watch this, even if you're just listening to the podcast, it is worth catching every second of this. So here it is.
Hit my idols because you guys are celebrating his life.
It was a terror. I'm sure it was a
This is
terror.
not okay. Okay.
You're alive. Shut up.
You guys need to just let it go. Grief in silence. This is not okay. This is not a George Floyd situation. George Floyd was unarmed. He was unarmed.
You're alive.
This is not okay. My kids have to deal with this and probably have a mental illness now because they almost lost their life. There's bullet holes in my kitchen because he sat in the fucking hallway watching my move.
This family wishes this never happened.
I wish it never happened either. That I don't have a place to call home. I can't sleep that night.
She's obviously going through a moment.
This is not okay.
This is what they want to show on the TV. She's obviously going through a moment.
This is not okay. Just go home. Go home. Because none of you guys knocked on that man's door to check his health.
Shut up. He comes to my house. Shut up, nigga. You're
No,
fucking
you
alive.
guys did not come.
Why do you
He did not. You guys did not come and visit that man. This is not the time or the place. It wasn't. It don't matter. It don't matter. Get away from me. Get away. No, because you think it's okay to get on my kid's in the car. My kid's in the car. My black kid is in the car. He tried to kill me in front of my kids. He tried to kill me in front of my kids. He tried to kill me in front.
Do you guys hear that protester whose response to her telling them that they were advocating for someone who tried to kill her and her innocent children? They said, "But you're alive, but you're not dead." So apparently this woman would only be justified in being angry that they're choosing to advocate on this man's behalf if she were actually killed. Apparently filling her apartment with bullets and threatening the lives of her and her children and attempting to murder her is not good enough for the woke left. She's not enough of a victim for them. And even if he had killed her, I still don't think that they would really care. I mean, clearly they have a victim standing right in front of them, and they still are either shell-shocked or unable to grasp the fact that their sense of justice is so insanely warped that they would rather protest on behalf of an attempted murderer who was, thank God, apprehended by police over someone who was just minding her own business in her home and had this attack happen in front of her children. It's so insane. I almost can't believe it's real, but I guess at this point, nothing really surprises me from the woke left. I think it's also worth pointing out that GoFundMe has this similar warped sense of justice as the woke left. They have allowed this page for this young man, Andrew Sundberg, who tried to kill this single mom. They've allowed his GoFundMe page, his fundraiser, to stay up. But remember, they removed a fundraising page for Kyle Rittenhouse, who was cleared on murder charges after claiming self-defense. And they also got rid of a GoFundMe fundraiser for the New York City bodega clerk who shot a robber in self-defense. And initially, this bodega clerk, his name is Jose Alba, was charged with murder in New York. And eventually, due to the public outrage, they moved to drop the charges. But he's not allowed to raise money for himself on GoFundMe. But the family of an attempted murderer who had this standoff with police snipers and was, according to some of the videos I've seen, an absolute nutcase, they're allowed to raise whatever money they want. So these platforms are part of this big tech stranglehold on our culture. They control far more than just speech. They control your finances. They control the way that people learn about incidents like this and the facts that are given to them. And it's really past time we do something about that. But that is a bit of a side story compared to the fact that this woman, this victim, is being shamed and silenced by these woke white liberals who would rather side with an attempted murderer because they're told that if you're Black, then you're a victim no matter what. You outweigh anybody else on the oppression scale, and a police officer, if they kill you, no matter what you did, you could be armed, you could be trying to kill somebody, you could have already killed somebody. It's not good enough. As long as you're Black, you get a free pass. And we've seen this before when mass shooters get arrested. The claim from the left is always, well, why didn't they kill the white mass shooter? You know, if the mass shooter was Black, they would have killed him. They would have never taken him into custody alive. It's like, why are we arguing about how police are treating mass shooters? Shouldn't we just be happy that they caught the guy? And by the way, in New York City, they were able to catch the Black subway shooter, but that somehow escaped the left's narrative. So it seems no matter how bad some of these people are, they push them into sainthood because of the color of their skin. And it's so warped, so backwards. This case in particular is absolutely crazy. And I just want to know if any of these protesters, after having this encounter with the victim, finally went home and had a look at themselves in the mirror and thought about what she said and reached the conclusion that maybe they were wrong. I mean, can we still do that in society? Do people still self-reflect and think about what they're doing and change? You don't see it very often. You certainly don't see it very often with the left. Usually they're just doubling down or apologizing to people even further to the left than them. But I hope that this was a come to Jesus moment for some of them, because to approach a situation so obviously Black and white from the complete wrong side of justice is just mind-blowing to me. I really can't believe that the events in that video actually occurred. AOC and Ilhan Omar went through another publicity stunt this week when they showed up at the Supreme Court in an effort to get arrested by police, and in the process actually faked being handcuffed. You have to see this to believe it, but first let's start with a little bit about the protest. So this was planned in advance, and not just the protest, but actually them trying to get arrested. That was the point of showing up. And these left-wing groups do this pretty frequently. They actually intentionally do something that they know is an illegal demonstration because they want the show of being arrested. They refer to it as civil disobedience, and this is a way to try to draw additional attention to their cause, because protesters getting arrested is more of a story than just protesters. So in this case, Jeremy Slevin, who is the communications director for Ilhan Omar, tweeted out that members of Congress, including Ilhan Omar, will be participating in a civil disobedience at the Supreme Court, potentially including arrests shortly. So they were well aware that they could be arrested because they were illegally demonstrating. So it turns out, according to reporting from Andrew Kerr at the Washington Examiner, that this was actually not just about members of Congress, but this was coordinated by a left-wing dark money group, including none other than George Soros. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and 15 other Democratic lawmakers who were arrested coordinated this with a progressive dark money group funded by billionaire George Soros. Apparently, this was organized by the Center for Popular Democracy Action Fund. They asked AOC and her colleagues to, quote, submit themselves for arrest in front of the Supreme Court. AOC claims that this was very different than a publicity stunt. This was an act of civil disobedience. So the co-director of this group, the Center for Popular Democracy Action, Andrew Friedman, told the Washington Post in 2018 that they get $1 million a year from Soros's Open Society foundations. And in this case, CPD Action was the group who asked these congresspeople to go out and get arrested in front of the Supreme Court. So AOC, Ilhan Omar, and other Democratic members of Congress go out in front of the Supreme Court, and as expected, they do get arrested, but they do not get handcuffed. So some arrests you get handcuffed, some you do not. It depends on the type of offense. In this case, they were not handcuffed. However, in the video, you see a police officer with his hand on AOC's arm, And AOC actually has her hands crossed behind her back to make it look like she's handcuffed. She has this big old smile on her face. She's very excited. But then when she gets a little bit further away from the camera, you actually see her raise her fist to someone else. So she has her hands behind her back, looks like she's handcuffed, and then all of a sudden she frees herself from the imaginary handcuffs and gives a fist pump and then keeps walking with a smile on her face. Let's go ahead and watch this clip. When Ilhan Omar is arrested, she does the same thing. She puts her hands behind her back in this handcuff position and then is again smiling, carrying on, and raises her fist to someone outside of frame. So both of them have this imaginary handcuff position on, but then they take their hands out of it to wave or do a fist pump to people away from them, clearly proving that there were no handcuffs on them in the first place. AOC has since claimed that she was not pretending to be handcuffed. She said in an Instagram story that she was putting her hands behind her back for safety reasons. She says whenever you're arrested, you should always put your hands in this position to avoid looking like you're resisting arrest. But if that's the case, then why would you then move your hands out of that position and put them up in the air? Wouldn't that be demonstrating to the officer that you are then resisting arrest if you've removed your hands from the behind the back position? Her explanation doesn't make any sense. PolitiFact decided to rate the claim that Ocasio-Cortez was faking being arrested. And I don't doubt that she was technically arrested and charged. And she did post this citation that she got. She basically got a $50 fine for organizing in an improper place. But when people are saying she faked being arrested, what they're saying is she faked this idea that the cops had thrown cuffs on her and dragged her out of the protest. It's such an exaggerated form of what happened, and it was intentionally done for publicity reasons. And when this first happened, we of course saw the headlines being pushed out from media outlets about how they had been arrested outside the Supreme Court in an act of civil disobedience, and it made it sound like they were, running around and disobeying police officers. But this was all pre-planned, and it was done intentionally for a very specific purpose. And they were encouraged to do this by a left-wing group that gets millions of dollars from George Soros. So just like everything in the squad, this is another phony piece of behavior. This is another fraud. And Ocasio-Cortez is really the queen of perpetuating this kind of phoniness. Remember back during the January 6th riots, she went on this tearful rant about how she was terrified for her life, and a police officer came to knock on her door to make sure she was okay, and she thought it was someone there to kill her. And so she was hiding, I think she said, in the bathroom of her office. Her office is not even in the Capitol building. It is in a congressional building, very far away. It's very unlikely that the protesters could have been anywhere near her office or that they would even know how to get there from the Capitol building. But she insists that her fear was justified because she had suffered a past sexual assault. And I've written about this before, but it really bothers me that she would make that claim. She's never talked about this publicly before, but she says it in response to her fears of the January 6th riots. And why did she do that? It's because she was using this as a political cudgel. She wanted to say, because I'm a past survivor of sexual assault, you don't get to criticize my reaction to this event because I was being re-traumatized. That is a way for her to shut down debate and prevent people from questioning the validity of her story. Because if you were to do that, she would claim that you were attacking a sexual assault survivor. And I think that's really a grimy thing to do, to use something like that, something so serious, in response to a political debate, I think is really disgusting and really icky. So it doesn't surprise me that AOC would turn around and then do this fake handcuff nonsense alongside Ilhan Omar, because this is a woman who has proven that she will sink to whatever depths possible to advance her political goals. It's 2022, and that means everything is racist, and the latest accusation of racism is against Sesame Street. There is a Sesame Street mascot at a parade outside of Philadelphia, and the mascot was walking through the parade and apparently snubbed two little black children. The parents of the children, the mother specifically, claimed that this was intentional because the girls were black. Now, this mascot from Sesame Street is named Rosita, which is presumably a Latinx Sesame Street character, but still, the insinuation is that the mascot intentionally ignored the two little black children because whoever was inside the mascot costume is a racist. Go ahead and watch the video, and I will describe what happens in it for people who are listening to the podcast, but give this a watch and see if you can just feel the disgusting racism oozing from this mascot. Okay, so for those of you who can't see the video because you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, what happens is this Rosita character is walking down the parade and basically is waving at people and saying hi, and these two little girls go up to try to get a hug from Rosita. And Rosita is seen making the no motion. But you can actually hear in the background of the video that there are parents asking for Rosita to pick up their children or hold their babies, which is against the Sesame Street rules. The mascots can't do that because it would be a safety issue. Obviously, you're in this big costume. You can't be picking up people's babies. So the no motion was apparently in response to people asking them to pick up their kids. And Rosita continues to walk past the two little black girls, and the mom claims that right after she walked past her children, Rosita went on to hug a little white girl. The mom complained to someone at the Sesame Street parade, said that she will never step foot in it again, and also wants her money back for the parade. So this was all turned into this major accusation of racism. Celebrities started actually chiming in on this. You had tweets from... Celebrities actually started chiming in on this. You had singer Kelly Rowland saying, "Oh, hell nah," on her Instagram. Jake Tapper did a segment about this on his CNN program. And you had, of course, left-wing activists jumping in on this as well. So Sesame Street initially posts an explanation of what happened. And they said, you know, we stand for inclusivity and equality. But when these performers are in the costumes, sometimes it makes it difficult, quote, to see at lower levels, and sometimes our performers miss hug requests from guests. The performer portraying the Rosita character has confirmed that the no hand gesture, seen several times, was a response to multiple requests from someone in the crowd who asked Rosita to hold their child. The Rosita performer did not intentionally ignore the girls and is devastated about the misunderstanding. We also invited them back for a special meet and greet opportunity with our characters. So they talked to the family, they offered this meet and greet, but that was not enough for the family. And Sesame Street ended up actually issuing a second apology. And this one didn't mention anything about the mascot not being able to see the children. And this one they said, "We are taking actions to do better. We are committed to making this right. We will conduct training for our employees so they better understand, recognize, and deliver an inclusive, equitable, and entertaining experience to our guests." So now I guess these underpaid 18-year-old mascots are going to have to undergo sensitivity training because of one out-of-context video that claimed them missing the hug from these girls was racist. The family actually hired an attorney to respond to Sesame Street, and they want an authentic apology as well as the employee to be fired. And again, this is presumably some minimum wage young person who is now being dragged through the mud because they decided that this was about racism. The attorney that they hired is none other than Benjamin Crump. And who is Benjamin Crump? Well, he is the same lawyer who represented the family of Jacob Blake after he was killed by police in Kenosha. And Jacob Blake was the individual who was clearly seen on video reaching into the door of his van to get a knife when he was shot by police officers. So Benjamin Crump, clearly a dishonest actor, so he's going to help smear Sesame Street and this poor person inside of the mascot costume. Now, I think it's important to include some personal information that I have about mascots, because I am good friends with a guy named Corey Ignanamort, who used to be Screech for the Washington Nationals. And Corey is now a producer on Vince Coloniz's radio show, and he gave an interview talking about the pitfalls of being a mascot and what possibly could have happened in this Sesame Street situation. And he said in this radio interview that it is very easy to miss little kids when you're in the costume. Your peripheral vision is shot. You're hot, you're sweaty, you're trying to meet and greet thousands of people. And yeah, you're gonna miss people on occasion. It's never intentional. And it's hard to even remember incidents like this because you're meeting so many people at the same time. He also pointed out that Sesame Street apparently only pays these performers $10.50 an hour. And he said there is no way that an actual trained mascot, a trained performer, would ever accept $10.50 an hour to be in that costume for a parade. So presumably that means the person in there is untrained, they're probably young, and are doing this because they were asked to by Sesame Street and probably couldn't say no. So the person who's in this costume is not even well trained enough to go down and see every child that they pass, which is already a difficult enough task for someone who is actually a trained mascot. And yes, mascots do go through pretty intensive training and work pretty hard. Those suits are pretty heavy and pretty hot. So I actually give them a lot of props for what they do. And I think it's just awful that this probably young kid is just being totally raked over the coals by people who are looking for incidents to fit this narrative of racism and not actually looking at these scenarios based on the facts as they occurred. I wanted to finish up this episode by talking about my home state of Maryland. I lived there until I was 22 when I moved to Virginia after college. And we just had the gubernatorial primary in Maryland, and Dan Cox defeated Kelly Schultz. Dan Cox is a candidate who is a state delegate and was endorsed by former President Donald Trump. And Kelly Schultz was the handpicked successor to Larry Hogan. She was the Maryland Commerce Secretary prior to running for the governor's seat. And there were a ton of media headlines that were just shocked that Larry Hogan's endorsement couldn't carry Kelly Schultz to the finish line. And Dan Cox didn't just win, he handily defeated Schultz by 16 points. He got 56% of the vote to Kelly Schultz's 40%. Now, to any conservative from the state of Maryland, this is not surprising at all that Trump's endorsement would carry far more weight than Larry Hogan's. And when you actually talk to people from the area, or if you grew up in the area, you know exactly why. Conservatives in Maryland are not like conservatives in otherwise blue states across the country, like in Maine, where you would elect Susan Collins. Conservatives in Maryland are pretty hardcore. Most of the conservative areas in Maryland are pretty rural, and we are pretty right-wing, right? So this is not the case of a moderate Republican Party being really prevalent in Maryland, and particularly not in a primary race. And conservatives in Maryland are not going to take seriously an endorsement by Larry Hogan because Larry Hogan's governorship to them, his 2 terms as governor, were relatively disappointing and frustrating because Larry Hogan didn't really do a whole lot for them. He lowered taxes and tolls and tried to make Maryland a more business-friendly state. But outside of that, he basically just kept the Democrats from doing really bad stuff, which is fine. I mean, that's probably better than the alternative, his opponent, Lieutenant Governor Brown. But it's not like it was a huge victory for conservatives. And especially when you look at the fact that most of his accomplishments were these economic gains, again, the tax cuts, those have quickly been undone by just a couple of years of Joe Biden being in office because of the massive inflation and supply chain issues. So Larry Hogan was creating this unnecessary feud with former President Donald Trump, where he was going out and talking about how much he didn't like the guy. He said he wasn't going to vote for him. He ended up actually writing in Ronald Reagan in the 2020 election. And this short-sighted, never-Trumper, moderate centrist nonsense is what led to us getting Joe Biden. I mean, besides the election fraud stuff, but put that aside for a second. It was very much these people who didn't like Trump's temperament, but liked his policies, but decided they couldn't put up with the mean tweets anymore, who then voted for Joe Biden instead of even sitting the election out. People like Larry Hogan. And you see the result of that. You see how quickly the country has gone into the gutter. So Larry Hogan undid all of this potential progress economically in Maryland by paving the way for someone like Joe Biden to be elected because he was worried about Donald Trump's temperament. And it really frustrated conservatives in Maryland who actually really liked Trump. And Larry Hogan lashed out at Trump at one point, saying, well, you lost Maryland by 30 points. Well, yeah, because Maryland has Baltimore and DC suburbs. And even Larry Hogan acknowledged that his victory in 2014 was a huge upset. So, of course, an actual conservative leader like Donald Trump is not going to do well in a blue state like Maryland. But it was so unnecessary for him to spark this feud. Now, in addition to his feud with Trump and his vote for Ronald Reagan and the very few things he actually did for conservatives while in office, Hogan actually had a horrible response to the pandemic, one of the worst in the country. He basically followed everything that DC and Virginia did. And Virginia at the time had Democratic Governor Ralph Northam, also known as Governor Blackface. So a little recap. Larry Hogan issued statewide lockdowns and implemented a mask mandate until as late as May 2021, which is the same time that Virginia Governor Ralph Northam lifted our mask mandate. He did not instruct public schools to return to in-person learning until March 2021, which was an entire school year, basically, after Florida had already returned kids to the classroom. And he also didn't even ask schools to lift their mask mandates until as recently as this past February. He also required COVID vaccines for healthcare workers and snarked that Marylanders should, quote, just get the damn vaccine. And he also asked public health officials to expedite vaccine approval for children as young as 5 years old. So across the board, he was one of the strictest governors on COVID, and this led to a lot of Marylanders struggling economically and mentally because of these crazy lockdowns that he implemented. So Trump gave Larry Hogan the nickname Shutdown Rhino, which I think is for good reason. So a lot of the Marylanders that worked really hard to get Larry Hogan elected in 2014 were very adversely affected by his handling of the pandemic. So it's really no wonder that they wouldn't be thrilled about trying to elect Kelly Schultz when she would presumably have much of the same politics and response to these situations as Larry Hogan did. Dan Cox is a proven, battle-tested conservative. You guys can go check out his record on his website. He's actually from not far from where I grew up. I believe he lives in Emmitsburg, which is just like 20 minutes down the road from my hometown. He's still in Frederick County. And great guy, reached out to me after I got fired from WMAL with some great words of encouragement, and is tried and true conservative on, I think, pretty much every issue. So, of course, Marylanders, after these 8 years of lackluster conservatism, if you could even call it that, from Larry Hogan, want someone who is actually going to fight for them. I think Dan Cox is going to have a hard time winning in Maryland. Again, this is still a blue state, and Larry Hogan was pretty moderate and still had this major upset. So it's going to be hard for him, but I really hope he does well. I'm really pulling for him because Maryland really deserves better governance after the past, like 3 decades it's been going on. It's so sad. And it could be such a beautiful, great state if they just were able to get the right political leaders in office. That's it for this week's episode of Unfit to Print. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for bearing with me over the break that I took on vacation. And again, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Rumble. And if you would like to become a premium subscriber, you can head on over to amberathey.supercast.com to check out our tiered subscriber system. And with that, I will see you guys next week.